For the entire history of D&D 5th edition and many editions prior, Leomund's tiny hut has been a mainstay of keeping characters alive in the wilds of the world. But in my opinion, this spell isn't even used close to its potential in D&D worlds. And the 2024 rules update for the game has arguably made this powerful spell even more potent. As always, my analysis relies on the assumption that there are spellcasters in the world that have affiliations with social structures, governments, kingdoms, and militaries, not just a collection of vagrant adventurers or beleaguered academics. With this said, let's look at the newest iteration of Leomund's tiny hut, how it absolutely dominates most defensive engagements and must needs become a military mainstay in most D&D worlds. Tiny Hut takes a minute to cast, or 11 minutes if cast as a ritual, which also saves the caster from using up a 3rd level spell slot. It requires verbal, somatic and material components and creates a 10-foot emanation around the caster, which lasts for up to 8 hours. The magical emanation created by the spell remains stationary for those 8 hours, and bars all creatures and objects from passing through the borders of the emanation, unless those creatures or objects were within the spell's emanation area while it was being cast. Although the spell does fail if any creatures that are within the area of the emanation are not fully encompassed by it when the spell is being cast, this same is not true of objects. So this region can definitely encompass ceilings, walls, and floors. Unlike the 2014 version of the spell, this is an emanation and not a dome. Therefore, it creates not a hemisphere of force, but an entire sphere of protection around the caster. So tunneling into the dome from below no longer works, nor does trying to pass through ethereally. And I know that there's sage advice that says that the original one in 2014 had a flaw. It's not mentioned in the spell text. It's not part of the spell. All creatures and objects not within the space when the spell is cast, whether they're tunneling or ethereal, are barred from entry. As a trade-off, though, instead of blocking all spells and their effects, the 2024 version only blocks spells of 3rd level and below from having their effects extend within or move into the area of the tiny hut. The final limit to this spell is that the caster must stay within the sphere that they have created for the entire time that they want the spell to continue existing. If they step out of the tiny hut, the spell ends. The rest of the spell description is technically cosmetic, but that's only because it discusses the material realities of the tiny hut as it exists and is seen in the world. From the outside, it is opaque, it cannot be seen through, and it can be any colour the spellcaster desires. And inside the space is comfortable and dry, and can be lit by dim light or no light, depending upon the wishes of the spellcaster at will. Crucially, the opaque walls from the outside are transparent from the inside. So you may be thinking, what's so special? It's a bunker that keeps people and objects out. It's a bunker that keeps people and objects out as long as the spellcaster stays within that bunker for the full duration of the spell, up to 8 hours. But it doesn't keep out any spell of 4th level or higher, or anything like a dragon's breath, a non-spell-like area of effect. How can this possibly be among the most potent defensive tools in D&D worlds? There's a few reasons. We'll start with the basics. In a wilderness survival situation, this is better than any tent, and only takes 11 minutes to put up if you want to do it without any cost to your magical prowess. You don't have to carry it with you, and no matter how cold or horrible it is outside, how much rain is lashing down, you will be dry and comfortable as soon as this hut springs into existence. Now, it is likely that a competent tracker would be able to tell exactly where a tiny hut had been during such a miserable night, either lashed by rain or cold, by the lack of mud or unpleasantness or the drying out of the soil in the area where the dome would have been. But then again, these are also risks with larger camps as well. More useful in the dangerous sort of wilderness of a D&D world is the guarantee that you're not going to be bothered by any wild beast or monstrous creature, as most of them can't do much beyond the walls of the spell unless they have access to 4th level magic. Even creatures who can innately teleport almost always need to be able to see the target area they're teleporting into first. So the opaque protection, in this case, really helps. Furthermore, the transparent nature of the walls from within makes any approach of any such horrible creature very visible if you have a watch stationed, which, why wouldn't you? In protecting people, valuables and food on long wilderness treks through dangerous wilds, it is already an invaluable tool that would be heavily sought after by the wealthy folks who need to travel in any D&D world, alongside just providing an implication to any chancers or bandits that you almost assuredly have a magic user capable of at least 3rd level magic with you right now, if there is a tiny hut in existence in your camp. And this spellcaster will also have access to the sending spell, so that they can summon allies or extra defenders to help them, even if the bandits decide to stage an ambush. Because the classes that get access to Leomund's tiny hut in 2024 are bards and wizards, both of whom get access to the sending spell. There might be a little bit of trouble with this, because technically sending may not be able to escape the spell's walls. Depends on your reading here. But what I will say is that a 4th level sending spell would work just fine, giving a reason for that spell to be upcast. In a similar vein, if you can see an ambush being prepared around you in the 8 hours that you have of safety, well, the caster could theoretically also cast another tiny hut while the duration of their current one remains, ready to release at the moment that their current one falls. The only stipulation, if you can't use magic within this area of 4th level or below, well, the only stipulation there is just cast Tiny Hut at 4th level this time, and a sphere of force will spring up again, giving you another 8 hours. Now, I may be being a bit overcautious in my reading of Tiny Hut here, because technically the spell states, spells of level 3 or lower can't be cast through it, and the effects of such spells can't extend into it. In theory, this does not bar spells from originating within the area, but I would potentially argue that a new tiny hut would extend into the area of an old tiny hut. That would be my ruling. It's not abundantly clear. Erring on the side of caution, casting your spells at 4th level while inside is a reasonable solution. Okay, but what if someone decides to exploit the fact you're in a stationary, fairly obvious position by placing, say, a massive weight on top of your tiny hut? Or stationing dozens of individuals with drawn arrows around for the moment that tiny hut drops and they can shoot you? Surely your impenetrable dome is really quite vulnerable to a Wile E. Coyote-style trap. Well, not really, seeing as the interior border is transparent and creatures within can therefore see out any potential Rube Goldberg machine or trap or ambush is going to be very likely to be spotted by the individuals within if they're looking. And remember, any creature or object within the area of the tiny hut when it is cast can pass through this sphere freely. An archer with hundreds of arrows, for example, holed up inside a tiny hut with their mage friend, would be essentially untouchable, barring 4th level magic. And if one side of the engagement, either the attackers on a tiny hut or the defenders within a tiny hut, is more likely to have 4th level magic, well, I put that on the defenders since they guaranteed have 3rd level magic. And unlike in the prior version of the spell of Tiny Hut, well, 4th level magic from within can certainly also reach outside. So our spellcaster of Tiny Hut can also make themselves very useful in a pinch if they have access to fairly high level magic. Another benefit, every attack made from within the Tiny Hut's space that uses an object that was in there from the start and is therefore free to pass through the walls, like an arrow, will at very least be a neutral roll to hit, if not at advantage, because the people outside of the dome cannot see inside, they cannot see their attacker, therefore the attacker has advantage. You can see your enemy, and they can't see you. So this is already fairly powerful sounding, creating a climate-controlled safe haven / one-way viewing bunker turret in 1 minute, allowing travellers genuinely safe harbour in no matter what horrific environment they find themselves. But this isn't the power of the spell. Leomund's Tiny Hut really largely shines in its broader military applications. In a pitched battle, having a contingent of archers, or depending on tech level, gunmen, sitting in an inviolable bunker with a wizard or bard is a pretty hefty advantage. That bunker is essentially not stormable by any normal means unless an enemy spellcaster comes out within range of their spells to try and either dismiss it through Dispel Magic or to rain down area of effects on it that are very, very costly and may be able to be counterspelled by the individual inside anyway. Bearing in mind, the magic user would also need to get within range of their offensive spells to do anything to the Tiny Hut to start with. It is likely that advanced teams comprising of 1 or 2 mages and a whole bunch of crack shots would be sent out into any potential battlefield as scouts or advanced forces, with all the ammunition they can carry, with the goal of radiating fire en masse in an essentially impossible to storm bunker, unless they're spotted in transition or the enemy has a spellcaster competent enough to drop a meteor swarm on them from a mile away. But the major strategic power of Tiny Hut comes more in defense, not necessarily in pitched battle. Although, historically, I must say, in a lot of pitched battles, you knew where the battlefield was likely to be, so this would still be a fairly solid strategy. And the defensive uses of Tiny Hut aren't just limited to creating unstormable bunkers, either. One of the most overlooked features of Tiny Hut is the space that it takes up. This is a 20-foot diameter sphere. This is not inconsiderable, space-wise, and the fact that the area can extend into walls, floors, and ceilings alike means that Tiny Hut can essentially be used as an impenetrable ward or corridor plug. In an underground or interior environment with enclosed tunnels or corridors, this is really quite potent. Perhaps just 2 or 3 of these tiny huts could close off an entire military or civilian complex for up to 8 hours, or days if you have, say, a team of 2 mages starting their tiny hut together with considerable supplies. It would probably be faster to try and dig through walls or floors or ceilings than to wait for such mages to give up if they were well supplied. It might be quite a cool dynamic to have these kind of meditative, near mystical, monk-like wizards sitting in important thoroughfares, blocking off the entire space with their radiant tiny huts, leaving the people behind them that they are protecting to come up with a plan for a counterattack or to escape from the invading threat. Especially considering that we could combine these tiny huts with a set of archers, firing projectiles over and over and over again at anyone who attempts to try and mine around or dig around or do anything to get past this tiny hut or into this corridor. For a castle, a tiny hut bristling with soldiers placed on every entrance, or within every entrance, would be a major pain to get through without significant magic of your own. And even then, you are bringing your spellcaster in full contact and most likely full view of a set of sharpshooters trained to take them down from within an opaque sphere of force. But the defensive potential of Tiny Hut really reaches its peak when we start talking about siege weaponry. To be very clear, the Tiny Hut explicitly permits the passage of any object that is within it when the spell is cast. This also includes ballista bolts and cannonballs. If this spell were incorporated as part of the defense plan of a fortress or castle, well, it would be a heck of a lot more difficult to overrun. Imagine, if you will, that every tower of a fort or castle has a bubble on top of it, which hides a movable weapon of significant power, like a movable ballista, for example, and also prevents any aerial bombardment or any aerial attack from exiting into the tower from the stairs on the top, because nothing can pass through except if it was in there originally. Or perhaps imagine a set of bubbled ballistae across a defensive wall, each one firing constantly at any attempt to take the position, and even if the wall gets overrun, the ballistae can still turn and fire essentially horizontally on each other across the wall at any advancing army without any risk of hurting their own side. Because they're protected by the tiny huts, the very ones that are allowing some projectiles out and blocking those very same sides projectiles from damaging the other ballista. If you manage to have all of your defenders inside these bubbles strategically placed enough, theoretically the entire invasion force is entering into some sort of killing floor, unless they can find a gap in your armour or a powerful enough mage to deal with you. But what if, for whatever reason, perhaps game balance, your table decides this interpretation that you can just fire attacks through the tiny hut is ridiculous? That it's just too powerful and doesn't seem like what they intended when they said objects can pass through. They didn't mean that attacks can pass through, right? If, for some reason, this gets argued, which I have seen happen, you can still use cannon. Historically, wheeled cannons with their own carriages were fairly popular, especially on large gunships. Because essentially, you don't want an open porthole all the time, except when you're pushing a cannon through it to make sure that it's not going to hit your own ship and it's just going to fire out. The same principle really applies with a tiny hut. Light the fuse, wheel the cannon outside of your tiny hut, let the attack happen, and then either pull it back in or just use the momentum of the force of the shot itself to push the cannon back towards you. It's how things were done on these multi-cannoned galleons for the entire Age of Sail. In this way, the attack does not originate inside the tiny hut, and the individuals attacking are not putting themselves at risk of a prepared set of reaction attacks upon seeing anyone poke their head out to make a shot. It's just a cannon. The reason I mention this is that ever since the spell came out, there have been DMs trying to counter it. Most of these attempts sometimes can be quite successful because they're based on two assumptions. One, the inhabitants are an adventuring party, and two, they need a short or long rest. For adventurers, ambushes, setting traps from enemies, and all sorts of things like this, they make some degree of sense because the characters are likely too tired and exhausted and in need of hit points to risk any sort of prolonged engagement. And so they have to wait for their spells and their bodies to recover in this long rest time, allowing for creatures outside to try and get tricky. Now, in the military applications I've just outlined, these two conditions are not present. Most military-style engagements, including pitched battles and sieges, traditionally, historically, allow for more than 1 minute's worth of preparation. Any self-respecting fortified structure would have scouts, beacons, watchtowers, or any of the like to attempt to forewarn the garrison that something is coming, so that the tiny huts can hopefully be set up as a ritual. Generally, you'll have time to set up a tiny hut in an area that is not immediately under threat to make the rest of the battle far, far fall in your favour. And seeing as attackers or besiegers generally need to advance their position and are not just simply holding ground, it's more difficult to position a tiny hut in an advantageous place if you are the offending army. While most adventuring fights begin at the drop of a hat, and so spending a minute's worth of casting and protecting your mage just so you can sit inside a small place and making sure that none of you leave that area while the spell's being cast is just not feasible. But most military engagements, especially on the level where mages that are able to cast third level spells may be involved, well, there is forewarning. They almost always follow some rules of engagement and have prior negotiations before any fighting breaks out. Time to prepare. Even if your walls are attacked by surprise in the middle of the night, well, the fact that you have walls should give you at least a minute to prepare. But why leave all of the fun in the hands of militaries and garrisons protecting castles and forts? If you, as a DM, want a way to use this spell right now, just think about what a dungeon is. It's an interconnected set of rooms and tunnels where monsters live. Why not include some advanced scouts, guards, or watchmen? This is just reasonably good practice from any intelligent monster that may be living within. Why not include an alarm? And why not present your players with an interesting tactical puzzle if they fail to infiltrate unseen, in that alarm being raised and the resident monstrous spellcaster making a tiny hut bristling with weapons and archers and blow darts and all sorts of wonderful things like that, waiting around the next corner. Heck, the next time your players decide to take a rest in a quiet corner of a dungeon in their own tiny hut, don't try to ambush, set traps, or annoy them. Yes, you might disrupt their sleep, but eventually they will realise the strength of the meat grinder they have created. Let them rest. Maybe one monster spies what they're doing, decides to report back, and well, tries to do the same thing. They try to set up their own tiny hut in the next room, just out of sight. Only the monster's one is not intended for sleeping, regaining those lost hit points. It's made for fighting. So that's tiny hut. Brown spheres of impenetrable bristling archers, the same colour as the mud in No Man's Land. Bubbles sitting atop of castle towers, raining ballista bolts and cannonballs down on any potential attackers. They might just be able to drop a cannonball and still do something. Tunnels plugged with spheres of force as meditating mages, think Jedi, think perhaps even Luke buying time in The Last Jedi, protecting their allies by essentially making themselves into a giant roadblock, turning themselves into turrets with prep time, which I would argue most military engagements do tend to have. Tiny hut is possibly the strongest defensive tool a D&D world has to offer. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Now, if you've made it this far, I do hope you're a fan of me, a fan of what I do, and a fan of the things I like. And what I do really like is Homie and the Dudes, The Wandering Tavern. It's a great setting book with a whole bunch of character, art, illustrations, and even part cookbook within it. It has everything you need to run a flying tavern in the sky. It's really good, and the company is committed to not using artificial intelligence, and it's family run. It's all the sort of things I love. And I've managed to negotiate a whopping 30% discount for viewers of the channel using code GrungeonMaster. So if you are at all interested, do head down there. I love what they do. It's really good, and I'm excited to see what they're putting out next. So if you are interested, do check them out in the description below. By following that link and using that code, you'll also be helping out the channel, which is, in my view, a win-win. You're getting cool stuff for cheaper, and I get a little extra for sending you there. What's not to love? But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.